Good evening and welcome to South France here, and welcome to the people around the world. This is the second to final course in the series from fractalu.com entitled The Science of and Hygiene for Bliss. This is a course about the practical aspects of achieving charge density and bliss in your life. It's not intended to replace religion, but it's intended to show that there's so much beautiful science that can empower us around ancient religious traditions, and very practically allow us to answer the questions about how do we apply all this wonderful theory about implosion and fractality and attracting charge to our lifestyle to do what's important to do, which is namely attract a very large aura, charge, spirit, chi, baraka, shaktipat, all the names we have for this living plasma of the Holy Ghost, as it were. So attracting this charge is very much the science of bliss. And that's what we want to go through tonight, is the steps in the science of bliss and how to put it in practice practically in your life. Now, the textbook, the PDF, the graphics for this evening's course is the original book here, Secret Science of Ecstasy and Immortality on Implosion, one of my earlier books with my partner Valerie. The website for that complete PDF is goldenmean.info/consciouskids, in case you haven't already checked it out. And we'll be talking about some of that material this evening. And that's really our attempt to summarize many of the hygiene ideas here. One of the intentions behind that book was that we recognize that our teenagers are quite willing to risk their lives to have a bliss experience, sex, drugs, rock and roll, and rave concerts, as it were. And yet we recognize that if we are correct, that if accessing some form of bliss is basically how you get the charge density, which is a sustainable immune system, and which is how you get the coherent aura, which allows you to take memory through death, then in fact, the most important scientific thing you can be doing with your life is building your aura, because that's how you generate the life force necessary to become quite literally immortal in this sense, if we understand the science of death well, as how you take memory through by compression. And we'll talk about that a bit. The point being that if our teenagers are risking their lives to have bliss experiences, and most of Western civilization is regarding bliss as implicitly illegal, then something is wrong with culture. And we had this old conversation we've talked about many times, that in fact, from this perspective, if we're right, that the only way you actually get a sustainable immune system and become your own source of charge, which is the end of being a parasite electrically, is literally to find a source of bliss. And so if that's true, then the definition of culture is not the color of your shoe polish and your bow tie and your wine. The definition of culture is, do you have the skill to teach your young people how to have a bliss experience, as we've said many times. And from that definition of culture, most of Western cultures do not have culture. And that would be my view. Whereas most of indigenous cultures, Aboriginal, etc., did have culture because they had the skill to teach their young people how to achieve bliss. It's more than just trance experience. It's the true charge radiant bliss experience, which allows so many of not just the transcendent functions and not just about what keeps your memory through the death experience, but also literally defines the sustainability electrically of your immune system, as in harmonic inclusiveness and fractality in the heart rate variability define immune system from medical studies. That's the article, goldenmean.info/holarchy. So this is another way of saying in science that religion has been correct. If you can attract grace and the spirit, then in fact you have led a successful life. So we're saying that religious traditions have been correct. What we believe now is not so helpful about religious traditions is personality and miracle worship, since what's needed is the self-empowerment that comes from understanding from core pure principles all of these things which used to be called spirituality, which now really come under the realm of science in a way that makes spirituality even richer. So this being said, when we used to talk about the science of bliss in many of our courses, we taught 4- and 8-day courses around the planet for many years, and one of the purposes of the courses here at Fractal U is to create a series of films which would somewhat make shareable those courses we did around the world in locations in Australia and the States and all over Europe, taught in most of the major cities of the West. And of course, jet airplanes may be responsible for premature aging because they don't have the right capacitance. Aluminum tubes, highly biased voltage, electrosmog, no, not good for your aura. So if you want to avoid jet airplanes, use state-of-the-art communications. Here we are together, and also then teach teach the bliss-making science in a way that's more shareable, which is what we're doing here. And this is not just to invite questions from those who are present, but invite questions around the world. So when we taught those courses, we suggested that it is appropriate to just arbitrarily divide the hygiene for bliss science into 4 basic categories. One category being environment, as in clothing and architecture, for example. Charged dense materials in your environment allow your aura to breathe. So the environment, and that includes geobiology. And then the second aspect would be the kinesthetic, the yoga, the physics of why certain movements are charge attracting, and in addition to building your body strength, etc. The yoga actually allows you to build a bliss experience from the proper calculus of curvature of the quality of grace in movement, so that the right angle of curvature in a movement causes your finger or your body to tingle, and that's actually implosive to capacitive charge. So that we have the yoga. And in fact, when you begin to have bliss experience, because it's like living in a lightning bolt, it's necessary to have the inner muscles which yoga develop, otherwise the bliss can become very ungrounding. Specifically Kundalini, for example. If you have in Kundalini, that is most often diagnosed as schizophrenia, sadly, because doctors don't understand bliss. And yet, if you don't develop the inner strength to handle that lightning with discipline and yoga, then it becomes very destabilizing. And yoga, and rather Kundalini, can be literally life-threatening. And we joke sometimes, but it's truly sad that the Pope formally pronounced yoga to be part of the devil, because this is another indication, sadly, of the obsolescence of the Catholic tradition. Yoga simply means hygiene, and it's the hygiene for bliss, and it is essential. So we had the categories of environment and yoga and movement, and then we had the category of the diet, and we talk about the various aspects of the diet for bliss, and we're going to go through some of that this evening. Live food and life force in food and genetic diversity. Many of the things you already know, but you can analyze all of these things from the basis, will it feed my aura? The joke was, the ancient Egyptian term for to feed your aura is fa'atun, to feed your sun body, fa'atun, which became our word fatten. So will it fatten my aura, fa'atun? And from this perspective, we understand Celestine prophecy when they said all human interaction is about charge. And what they meant by that was quite literally, you select who to kiss, and where to sit in the room, and what to pick up in the grocery store. And fundamentally, it is correct to say that you then begin to make all the decisions in your life based on one simple question: is my aura going to grow or not? Fa'atun, feed my sun god. And it seems maybe shallow at first, but eventually you begin to realize that you can make subtle decisions based on this criteria as well. For example, should I give money to that beggar? Or am I going to follow my bliss? There's many decisions. Who am I going to dance with at this party, or which music am I? All of these questions, you can provide yourself a pretty significant answer if you say to yourself, is my aura going to grow or not? Like if somebody says, well, I want you to take this 6-hour trip in the car with me, and you think about your car, the metal car, and your aura, and you think, no, is it that important? And the other fundamental issue about this is that it used to be that feeding your aura was a subjective thing. But now that's no longer true. We have Dr. Karatkov's GDV here, the current version at bio-well.eu, the GDV, gas discharge visualization. It's a kind of clinically calibrated Kirlian. You have the fingerprints, and your fingers tips make 10 Kirlian photographs, and the computer extrapolates your aura picture. Now, the earlier version may have had greater replicability, and there's lots to be discussed about advancing this as a science, but clearly that the concept that the aura is measurable is a breakthrough to spiritual science. For example, you're having a discussion with your teenage child about using recreational drugs. And it used to be that you say, well, you get parasites in your aura and your holes in your aura. Well, no longer is it necessary to guess. You can quite literally see the holes in the aura with the GDV, and the physics of why recreational drugs and alcoholisms and various addictions create holes in the aura is clear. And this is called astral hygiene, and very much part of our conversation about the hygiene for bliss. Namely, that what holds your aura together, and this is the fundamental science, your aura is literally a cold plasma field. We know a lot about what cold plasma is now. The original article now, working with Keshe and the monoatomics, fractalfield.com/cold plasma. So your spiritual aura is cold plasma in the following sense, that it used to be that we thought a cloud of charge, which is 99.99% of the universe, according to physics, that a cloud of charge had to be hot in order to remain mobile as a cloud of charge. And hence the concept of plasma is usually associated with heat. However, under certain circumstances, namely, in my view, implosive phase conjugate negentropy, under those circumstances, clouds of charge do not have to be hot. And there are some examples of this, the Brown's gas, the blue flame that travels without, and the famous spiritual fire that does not consume. So there's many ideas about plasma fields that don't have to be hot to, in fact, be coherent clouds of charge. So we can talk pretty specifically now about what it is that you take with you through death. Karatkov measured this, I think it was 10 and 20 hours, a certain number of hours after death. This cloud of charge, your aura, which is the spirit, or as they call it, the selig, the soul, leaves your body. And he measured this by using corpses, actually. And he knows what the cloud of charge, your ghost, looks like and where it goes after death. The pictures are at goldenmean.info/immortality, and we've talked about this many times. So the point is that that cloud of charge, or ghost, tells us some very specific things about immortality and the science thereof. Namely, ghosts are measurable by, they create a cool spot. So you can tell a ghost is there often by a slight decrease in temperature. And we know why, because, of course, implosion is naturally cooling, as in Schauberger. The story was that his water vortex, before it began generating voltage from gravity, spontaneously began getting colder. Well, so we know why ghosts make it a little bit colder where they pass these plasma fields. But we also know a lot more. We know where they go and why. Generally, they go to the place of charge compression in the room, what Castaneda would have called the place of power, because they need implosive compression to gain charge distribution. Acceleration, implosion, phase conjugate fractal distribution. And that's an introduction to entering the collective unconscious, the communion of saints, the physics of where survival memory exists, and why, for example, Korotkov was able to measure where Kogi go to make the sacred tribe shaman South America, the Kogi, where they go to make telephone calls to ancestors is always in the presence of fractal air, which is how sacred space is measurable. We showed 3 ways to electrically measure sacred space at goldenmean.info/architecture, the top picture there, which one of those means is Korotkov's measure, the GDV, where he measures fractality in air. Another method is our biophoton spectrum analysis technique, goldenmean.info/biophoton. So, we now know that the cold plasma charge field you build coherently during your life is what enables you to take memory with you through death. That's a very important fundamental concept. And it's the beginning of being able to talk about spiritual ideals using physics and electrical engineering, which is so essential. If we understand that well, it means that the embedding, the fractal field design electrically is how you build a birthplace and a death place. It's how you build a graveyard, for example. It's how the Hopis designed their graveyards. Ancestral memories, living in dignity means no metal pipes, because anything that bleeds the capacitance, you see, which is the steel and aluminum pipes that the U.S. government tried to put on old Arribi, which caused a riot, well, it caused a rebellion among the Hopis, because they knew their ancestral memories required a certain quality of electric field, which we now know is called a very high dielectric, which is charge distribution enabled capacitors that ring efficiently. That's a definition of high dielectric. And so this describes the electric material required for hospitals and birthplaces and burial grounds to enable the building of the fractal field, the charge distribution efficiency. Another way to think about that is that when these fractal or conjugate or implosive capacitive environments are enabled, like where the Indian yogi lived to be hundreds of years old in India, well documented, they never do it in metal buildings. No, they do it in a cave. And the reason they do it there is because the aura is enabled to embed, implode, and breathe charge, and that's what allows the aura to grow. As in when Padmasambhava melted the stone, you can put your hand in the fingerprint, handprint where he melted the stone with his aura, and the platen of the Holy Grail where John Trophimus, the son portentously of Mary, melted the stone lid of his coffin in Arles, which later became called the Holy Grail. These are examples of someone whose aura who got a lot of charge, and when you build that kind of charge in your aura, you become the Jedi. This is the Force awakening in honor of this week's movie. And so this science of getting this aura embedded is what's behind a designed hygiene to accomplish that. Another example we like to give is from the Tibetan literature. I think there was a recent film of one of the advanced Tibetan lamas, their funeral. And as is famous and so common at the death ritual of advanced Tibetans, there's a dramatically increased number of rainbows. And we think that's so helpful because it demonstrates the physics that at death, your plasma, your charge envelope is centripetal. Now, if that embeds in your electrical environment, it creates a more phase conjugate centripetal electrical environment, and we demonstrate that that is quite literally the physics of how rainbows are made. Fractalfield.com/fractal photosynthesis. Type in some more links here for fun. Quite literally, when you are looking for the green flash, we did 2 or 3 days in a row in Perth in Australia, everything's perfect in the environment, totally flat sea. And if you think they're perfect, then you see a green flash at sunset. And the physics is rather well articulated, but the point is that what allows that differentiation to create the sorting into phase, which is called the physics of the origin of color, or phase conjugate physics, in my opinion, that all of that is enabled only if the environment is electrically centripetal, phase conjugate is implosive. It allows the discrimination of charge, which is the origin of rainbows. So you don't see rainbows where the air is messed up. And you do see rainbows where the capacitance of the air has become centripetal. And that's exactly what the aura of a saint does to the environment at death. So this gives you a whole lot more to think about now about why there were earthquakes when Jesus died, why they said, he will inhabit the earth, and all these metaphors. Well, they're quite literal. They're describing an activity where living plasma inhabits only certain structures which enable inhabiting. For example, it's not very useful to fall in love with a metal building, because if you try to embed your aura in a metal building, your aura will bleed charge. Bad idea. But it is a wonderful idea to fall in love with pure intention, because when you embed your aura in pure intention, you become centripetal with a more shareable wave. Well, they say you only fall in love with pure intention. We now know what pure intention is, a climax form of coherence, in our case, as we measured heart coherence as a measure of pure intention. So you could tell if someone was speaking with passion from their heart and telling their truth, their heart coherence would go up. And the climax form of coherence is phase conjugate, or fractal, which enables compression. So when a hologram has information about everywhere at each node in it, that is an example of successful compression at those nodes. Another way of saying phase conjugate fractality is the climax form of phase coherence, and thus defines the nature of pure intention, which is why your heart gathers inertia when it finds a wave which is shareable, which is to say an intent which serves the whole gene pool. So part of our conversation about the hygiene for bliss is recognizing this idea that if you think enough shareable thoughts, your aura gets immortal. What does that mean? Well, imagine if you were a scientist and you had a eureka experience one day. You're like, one day I was thinking about the nature of hydrogen, and I knew there were 3 radii of hydrogen that were golden ratio to each other. And then it occurred to me, they must also be golden ratio to the Planck center of hydrogen. And at that moment, my hair stood up. That was a shareable wave. I had discovered pure principle, the fractal phase conjugate definition of hydrogen, and the cause of the gravity that holds hydrogen together, my new equation for hydrogen radii. So that was an example, my little humble, I tripped over something. And but imagine you could have a eureka experience every minute or two for your whole life. Well, your hair would always be standing up. What would happen? You would never die. Well, the reason your hair stands up when you have a eureka experience is because you attract a lot of capacitance, biologic capacitance, which is another name, which is a scientific name for the quality of grace. In Catholic terms, the Holy Ghost. Well, yes, it is. It's holy plasma field, and we say plasma fields are ghosts, so I suppose you could call it a Holy Ghost. But it's something we can understand the physics of now, in the sense of the famous paper on phase conjugate dielectrics called Alice in Barium Titanate Land, where you get this phase conjugate fractal fields, and they appear to find each other even non-locally at a distance, and appear to self-organize and in a way that appears to be self-aware. Now, if you ever read a science paper, an electrical paper, that sounds like the collective unconscious, that's what it is, phase conjugate fractal field. So, we're just getting to the point where we can describe the electrical nature of these kinds of fields. And we're just getting to the point where we can talk about the psychology of how you get there. So why did your hair stand up when you thought something which was pure shareability, which is to say, of service to all of living DNA? If you figure out something that's truly of service to everything and everyone, Why does your hair stand up? See, if living plasma, the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, the Holy Fire, lots of names for this, but I'm an electrical engineer, so that's the language I find useful because it's a very shareable language. It allows measurement, it's a language of rigor and discipline, and it adds beauty to spirituality. So I think we can talk about why your hair stands up when you think a shareable thought in electrical terms in order to understand what pure intention is. In my view, DNA, we know from all this conversation we've been having. I'll type the graphics are at goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto. And we have all those graphics of DNA as a implosive fractal golden ratio negentropic field effect generator. From the center of DNA, the hydrogen bond at the center of every ladder rung, which I have proven is fractal, to the golden ratio in the pentahex of the ladder rungs, to the golden ratio in the spacing, to the golden ratio in the braiding. I mean, DNA is as golden ratio as anything in the universe, and it is for that reason specifically, in my view, the most multidimensional structure in the universe. And I say multidimensional in a very useful electrical sense because, in my view, the number of dimensions a structure exists in is the number of axes of charge, rotation, or spin which can be superposed. So you have a cube, tetracube, and you tilt the cube up and you rotate that 32 degrees, and that is a dodecahedron. So that's the fourth dimension, fourth spin, the hypercube is word. And then you rotate that dodeca down a helix, fifth axis of spin. And so there's 5 axes of spin in the thread that is DNA. But then if you take that thread and you braid on the braid on the braid on the braid 7 times, now I have 7 superposed axes of rotation upon the 5 inside, and the 7 outside is, if it's beginning to sound like the Anu, that's what it's supposed to sound like. 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside, 12 dimensions, 12 axes of spin superposed in your DNA. So instead of New Age woo-woo saying, have you got the 12th strand of your DNA going yet? No. What the correct term is the 12 axes of spin superposed entered into coherent phase discipline, which means that this braid structure, the ratio of the length of the braid in the thread to the braid in the rope to the braid into the fat rope, if there's a coherent phase relationship between the short wave and the long wave, that allows the perfect recursive embedding, which allows implosion in DNA. And I believe that was called Boson 7 at Montauk, predicting who could travel in time. And I believe that's quite poetically described as the microchloridians in the blood in the Star Wars series, indicating who could raise the Jed, which is to say who could put the sword from the stone, which is to say who could draw the charge, the line from the circle. So DNA, being of this such fabulous implosive and phase conjugate nature, has been in the business of collectivizing survival memory, which is to say survival charge symmetry. Survival memory and survival charge symmetry are the same thing. Survival patterns, survival information, survival charge field effects. So DNA has been the business of gathering survival information for how many billion years? We don't know. But it's inherently a collectivizing structure. That's why when 3,000 people die at one moment on 9/11, everybody on the Earth feels a shudder, as they proved at the Princeton noosphere, which is, they call it a Josephson junction, but it's in fact a capacitive gravity sensor in the sense of Hodorowski and Ramsey. That's what the Princeton noosphere is based on. So this ability to feel the whole field together is the nature of DNA. And as your DNA thus becomes more phase coherent, shortwave to longwave embedding, that's when you develop more compassion, literally your ability to feel or embed your plasma, not just inside your own DNA by perfect embedding, but then to embed yourself into others. And so then you begin to feel others' pain more, which is a beautiful indicator of evolution. Perfect. It all makes sense. So the remaining question is, how does Bliss cause your DNA to braid? And recursively and in a phase coherent way. And that's what we measured. At my suggestion, Glenn Ryan made those measurements after we worked together at HeartMath Institute. And what he showed was when you have coherent EKG, and remember my work, I'm the inventor of the concept of heart coherence, because I invented the mathematics for its proper measurement. It's fractalfield.com/coherence is the history of the measurement of heart coherence and my heart tumor invention. So when you have this onset of coherence in the EKG, what Glenn Ryan measured at my suggestion was an increase in the amount of braiding in the DNA. So what's happening is you have a coherent phonon sound wave in a liquid geometry from the EKG and the coherence of the sacrocranial pump and the heart rate variability, all that we were talking about last week in the course on our new heartsring.com app, which is I Thrive without the ITHRVE.com. That will be our new app. Stay tuned. And so when you have this cascade of coherent EKG and HRV harmonics, they look like a caduceus, quite literally, in the spectrum analyzer. We now know and can prove that this causes the DNA, the thread. Oh, here, sometimes we try to do a little, there's animations at the article on DNA Manifesto, but basically you have the DNA braids, the helix braids, and then there's a braid of the braid on the braid, so thread into string, into rope, into fat rope. That's a recursive nested embedding implosion operation in DNA. And we've proven that the onset of coherent EKG, Bliss, question mark, is quite literally, provably, and measurably the wave mechanic for braid implosion in your DNA. So, is there a happily ever after in there somewhere? Well, what we then extended that work into brainwave study, where we showed here, and I think we have some pictures now. Finally, we're going to get to our pictures. Yes, that the lady in Australia, she had this intense bliss experience, and she had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 harmonics in golden ratio in her brainwaves, and she was having this intense euphoria bliss experience. And by the way, that particular occasion, she had very little luck making coherent brainwaves before the lunch break, but then she went out with the shaman during the lunch break, amazingly, and the shaman said, we found basically childhood trauma. I mean, weeping, abuse. It was pretty intense, I believe. She came back after this, processing the childhood trauma after lunch, and her brainwaves were just this most fabulous, beautiful harmonic cascade. Here's the alpha in green, and oh, it's upside down here, but the alpha's in green, the beta's in purple. But you see, when the ratio, the frequency of the alpha to the beta gets golden ratio, and you can get 1, 2, 3, even 4 harmonics in golden ratio in the brain waves, your brain wave is phase conjugate imploding. And later we learned that the right hemisphere has to be 180 out of phase to the left hemisphere. The same frequency signature that makes our Therify.net work. It creates euphoric experiences as well as plasma. And when your brainwaves do that, the 2 pine cones kiss noses just like in a mirror. That's why they're 180 degrees out of phase conjugate. And when the wave goes down that screw, the pine cone, the visualization for phase conjugation, the rotational inertia is translated down the spiral, down the cone, from a transverse wave to a linear, or rather a compressional, a longitudinal wave. And it's a longitudinal wave mechanics, electromagnetic longitudinal wave mechanics, which we now know for sure is how Ingo Swann lit the flame, thermistor, with his mind at a distance through a Faraday cage, very measurable. That longitudinal EMF component will go through about anything, the Holy Ghost, the collective unconscious, and it's superluminal, faster than light, measurably, this longitudinal electromagnetic components are. And when you take these longitudinal components and cause them to reconverge at a distance, you can regenerate heat. You can do heat containment at a distance, the plasma fire, plasma containment, the holy grail of cold fusion, and we have an article about that, fractalfield.com/conjugate interferometry. And so this is the holy fire in Jerusalem. This is the Holy Ghost. This is the Foo Fighters. This is this is literally, we know exactly the microwave physics and the wavelengths required to make Luke Skywalker's. Oh yeah, his plasma sword. That's plasma containment. That's microwave interferometry. We know the wavelengths. We know how to do it. It makes the most of our fusion reactors obsolete, because the problem of fusion is plasma containment, and now we know what plasma containment is. It's longitudinal interferometry, and this is creation mechanics. And you know what the key is? The key is when Tom Bearden said, "You treat the atomic nucleus with a phase conjugate pump wave." Now, we're not going to get into all that stuff tonight. But you see, when you have Bliss experience, are then enabled to make this, I'm just going to move myself here. Yeah. When you have access to Bliss experience, you are enabled to create these longitudinal components. And that's which allows, for example, the Tai Chi master to push you over at a distance without appearing to move. Well, you see, the plasma aura that you are steering around is functionally a cold plasma charged tornado. And string theory, wormholes, everything in physics is a string theory and a wormhole. So we know that tornadoes always follow the center of lowest pressure. We've told this story before, but if you were watching a shaman steering a tornado, the first thing you see is the shaman says, "I'm eating the chucha," and he means I'm eating the anger, which is to say, I'm feeling the pain of the tornado. So much so that the tornado falls in love with the shaman, because the shaman feels the pain of the tornado better than it feels its own pain. Now, how could a tornado have pain? Well, that's important to know. Pain is defined by where fractality is broken, and therefore the charge is bleeding. Restore that fractal compression, you eliminate pain. And we proved it. Most everybody that came to therapy.net so far with pain has left without pain. It's shocking, but it's that simple. And that was the frequency signature, phase conjugate, magnetics, which Elizabeth Rauscher showed in her FDA study, reduced pain. That's the frequency signature we're using. Elizabeth Rauscher didn't know that I had an equation for that. So, restore compression, eliminate pain. Restore centripetal force, eliminate pain. So that's why the tornado likes the shaman, because the shaman says, "I feel your pain. I feel your pain." And then the tornado says, "Oh, what's pain for a tornado?" For example, if you're a tornado and you've been absorbing charge really well, over an ocean, for example, but then supposing you pass over land into Florida and you just came over a metal trailer park full of metal buildings and electrosmog, that's pain. Oh yeah, because over that structure the tornado cannot implode its capacitance, and so it's bleeding charge right and left. Very painful. So the tornado has to say, "Oh, the first thing a tornado needs to do is destroy the metal buildings." And tornadoes are famous for going out of their way to destroy metal structures because they're painful to the tornado. However, the tornado comes over the beach, and the first thing it finds is an ancient stone sacred temple. Does a tornado ever destroy? No, tornadoes never destroy sacred sites. Almost never. Why? Because the implosive capacitance of an ancient stone circle is the opposite of pain for a tornado, because it's centripetal. It allows charge distribution. A tornado loves that. So this is an idea why, when you're feeling the pain of tornadoes or feeling the pain of your friend, implosive embedding is the opposite of pain. So by generating the low pressure point with the most implosive, the most centripetal, the most phase conjugate, the tornado is steered by its center of lowest pressure. And another practical example of this, in the therapy.net, we have our friends here, Christine and Medrick, who operate the healing center where the Therify.net is used here in Perpignan. And Christine she's a clairvoyant. She sees auras. But she says the Therify makes the auras so much more visible that many people who can't see auras do see auras in the Therify.net. Obviously, it's why, because you have the same high voltage capacitive field that's 500,000 volts. It's a Tesla coil. And when Tesla first used the millions of volt sparks, Marconi and everybody came over to get healed in the blue sparks. So it was the same thing, and that's what inspired Lakhovsky and Priory, and that's why Therify.net exists, because of the lineage of the discovery of those frequencies, which I was the first to express in equation form, origin of biologic Nick entropy. So Christine there, who sees auras, she says, well, it's like you're getting inside this electrical tornado, but the most important thing you can do when you get in the center of so much charge is talk to yourself. What does she mean? She says, talk to your inner selves and visualize what they need, which is to say, set your intent. She says that's the most important part, because somebody else can light the tornado, but if somebody's not, which is to say a very powerful electrical device, Therify.net, but if somebody's not there to give the tornado direction. So that's the important point, that we can light the tornado for you, but ultimately it's the moment when you decide to steer your own tornado called self-empowerment. It's Lucifer saying, you too can be God, and he has this green stone, the eye of Lucifer. So the point is, actually, that's the moment at which you become of use to what you used to call God, because you're a self-empowered tornado. This is why self-empowerment and autonomy is sacred, to among spiritual cultures, because the recognition of the moment when you take responsibility for your own health, your own bliss, your own politics, your own government, your own money, your own religion, when you take responsibility for, that's actually what mea culpa, through my fault, mea culpa. No, it means it isn't I'm so grievously at fault. No, it means I take responsibility for. And the reason you thump your thymus at that moment is the phone on resonance is how your EKG and your heart rate variability takes responsibility for. So it's very important the frequency at which you thump your thymus when you say mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. The frequency signature, the low frequency harmonics, we know exactly what they need to be, because the heart rate, HRV, LF, and HF are pure phase conjugate pump waves, right down to my equation to Planck. So let's look at some of the conversation here before we get into, we're supposed to talk about the practical hygiene here. We're doing the philosophy at this moment, but Wayne says, Bliss states it helped me to improve my memory each experience. I can remember well in tough situations, making it each time a new problem arises. Exactly. Thank you, Wayne. The point being that particularly when you're in a stressful situation, if you've developed the yoga to go inside and focus, your aura implodes and more sorting happens because of phase conjugate neg entropy. And as more sorting happens, phase coherence comes in, your inner voice starts to work, etc. Your intuition works. We say that bliss experience is the climax form of education. Basically all encyclopedias are now available to you. In fact, what comes after the internet? Human biologic bliss, because that's the final Wi-Fi. True. By the way, present Wi-Fi and the final Wi-Fi are a little bit mutually exclusive, because most Wi-Fi frequencies, actually, I feel nausea every time I turn my Wi-Fi on here, guys. So I suggest you be very careful. And we know why, microwave and yes. But anyway, so that the access to this sort of biologic radio is your emergence into your own personal internet. It's quite literally that, because that's how you tune in to the mitogenic radiation, which is the collective unconscious, how the Kogi made phone calls to ancestors. And I might add, and I would like to emphasize, that Peter, who's doing a wonderful job at the Healing Center in Belgium, demonstrating Therify.net, says that one of the experiences that patients testing the Therify.net plasma field consistently report is improved quality of decision making. In other words, here we have a device which we know accelerates metabolism and accelerates charge and promotes a little bliss experience. And one of the things people report is, I'm making better decisions now. It's better than a fight in an Irish pub at which you say sorted, because the best sorting mechanism is the implosive phase conjugation at the center of negentropy. Okay. Eden Grace says, so the shaman maintains fractality and bliss, therefore does not hold the pain of the tornado. Is that how someone who is sensitive, empathic, can feel others' pain without holding it and getting sick? Ah, see, now that's becoming a trickier question. Thank you for asking the important questions, Eden. No, I would say that the way in which pain is processed is it goes through the most implosive part of your body. So supposing you're going into a room that has a lot of ghosts, yeah, you know, a war site, or there's many sites in South America where lots of people were killed, human sacrifice. So you know there's a lot of ghosts there. And any ghosts that are left over are needing something. And what they need is they need a plasma field in which to implode to get up to speed to achieve charge distribution, or they're stuck. It's basically a charge bubble that's isolated until it can find fractal implosion and achieve charge distribution and enter the collective unconscious, ancestor memory, etc. So until they can get to the center of the fractal and spin out, which is to say implode and get distributed, those ghosts are stuck. And your body, they may see as the way out, particularly if you have lots of charge. Now, there is a way to send them through the center of your heart and not have too much residue, and that is called astral hygiene, and that's a shaman's training, and that's part of what we wanted to work on with Sarah there at 7arrows.net, is this electrical skill and hygiene to not leave too much residue in your own aura. So basically, pain is when, you know, the aura is bleeding charge, and if your aura is weak and has holes in it, then parasitic entities can enter you. Whereas if you're imploding, which is to say you have a source of bliss, then the nature of the fire in your heart, in your center of gravity, your center of implosion, your center of blue flame, the nature of that flame is such that parasitic material is toasted in the presence of implosion. This means that, you know, digestive parasites and aura parasites both are killed, which is to say are sorted and spun out in the presence of bliss. So human bliss process is the opposite of parasites. Well, and conversely, depression invites parasites, because when you're depressed, you get holes in your aura, et cetera, et cetera. And you see this intimate relationship where Upledger, the world's leading sacrocranial teaching institute in Florida, claims that if your spine liquid is pumping, it is then clinically impossible to be depressed. And now we have proved that the Mayer wave, close to the HRV LF wave and the LF and HF wave, and that the sacrocranial pump frequencies, as measured in the sacrocranial, they're called the long tidal and the short tidal, that those exact frequencies are a phase conjugate pump wave, implosive collapse, which is literally what's driving the ventricle liquids of the brain cavity, as Benthoff measured for Kundalini, which is bliss. And so both of those charts are in my newest book, fractalfield.com, the Fractal Space-Time, the chart of the harmonics of the brain, of the spine liquid pump, and the chart of the harmonics of the ventricle, ringing in the ears, sangreal, song in the blood, heard by meditators. The ringing you hear in your ears a lot of times indicates clairaudience, which I'm familiar with. And those frequencies in the ventricles, the ring in the ear, and the frequencies of the spinal cord, all fit the equation for phase conjugate implosive pump wave and the harmonic series of the brainwaves, all of which is the implosive wave mechanics of human bliss process. So you can see when that whole mechanism is working, that is the electrical opposite of parasites. So as long as you're carrying your memory of bliss, this blue fire axis, inside with you, you won't have a problem with parasites. But in the meantime, don't tackle really big ghosts until you get some practice and experience as a shaman. Shaman meaning plasma projective. And what we are saying here is the skill in the Castaneda sense of being plasma projective, like the tensegrity exercises, the yoga, that you learn to project your aura like it was pulling a carrot. That plasma projective defines shamanism. It defines birth and death. It defines magic. It defines ritual. The ability to project biologic living plasma and steer it around. We used to think this is some great cosmic spiritual mystery. No, it's not a mystery. There's a cloud of charge, my aura moving out of my body can be navigated with very specific wave mechanics and something you can understand for yourself. And there's a section in the curriculum for tonight's course about that. Maybe we could. So here was from the book, which is the subject of tonight's course, Conscious Kids, and this was the sort of table of contents. There's a section on sacred alphabets. Now we knew, you've all heard this a dozen times before, so I will only do it very briefly, but self-organizing golden spiral on a self-organizing torus. And if you look at that from the angle of the 7 arrows through a tetrahedron, the shadows it casts, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, the Hebrew alphabet, and also Sanskrit, we believe, and many ancient alphabets, which was self-organizing, and it was simply the index to nest donuts in a tetracube with 7 arrows, 7arrows.net. Now, if your brain is the holographic brain, Carl Pribram, etc., or if your optical cortex is lighting up like filling a donut with charge, then if you remember when the rabbis gave instructions on how to visualize a Hebrew letter in order to make a golem, what they said was you needed to fill your inner screen, your optical cortex, completely fill it with oneness of focus on one letter of Hebrew, which is to say, to tilt that torus donut, of which everything in physics is made, and the magnetosphere of your brain, the charged donut. You're blowing a smoke ring and choosing the angle. So you choose the angle, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, or Hey, at this particular angle, Hey. When you visualize the Hebrew letter, and then just like the horse whisperer, when he finally decides to send the thought form to the horse, very slowly, one at a time, you fill your mind with the thought form, and then you stamp your foot and you release the thought form, and that's the moment at which the horse sees what you're sending. Well, the same is true with you're throwing this magnetic donut to the center of the room, and you do 4 donuts at exactly opposing tilts, and when they arrive at the room at the right angles, so that when they meet, they're at conjugate angles, they make a centripetal field called casting a spell, or a dream spell. And in a proper ophanic or other ritual, the saying is you blow the doors off the church. Well, actually what happens is the air pressure in the room is dramatically affected because of this physics of creating a centripetal field. So, there you are. You just died. And you had been an astronaut. And you knew that in order to navigate when you're in space, you need to be able to choose vector directions to push little propulsors. So here you are, I'm this plasma donut, and I'm traveling after death, or I'm traveling in a lucid dream, and I would like to squirt my donut in order to be able to navigate. 2 things required. 1, emotional coherence. The hero in the movie Ghost, recognizing that his alive lover is not going to recognize him as a dead ghost unless he can move that penny. How does he get enough electrical coherence as a ghost to move a penny? Well, it had to do with passion, actually coherent emotion, but he did. Well, the other thing you need is a sequence of understandings of vector directions called ancient sacred alphabets. And then you can steer when you are a cloud of plasma. Now, right now, you are a cloud of plasma, but you have a lot of inertia. That's fun. But ultimately, sustainability, immortally, taking your memory through your sun and all the fun stuff requires that you be able to take that cloud of plasma and steer and navigate and have perceptions with a great deal of phase coherence, with a lot less baggage, body, you know. And so you take the opportunity while you have a body to develop a lot of inertia in your aura, and then you can throw your weight around. I mean, throw your aura around. I mean, you get the flavor. So this is the bit about why the ancients always said that, you know, your extraterrestrials, if they came in a heavy metal craft, were from the wrong side of the tracks, whereas if they came in a cloud of plasma through the heart of the sun, called sun gods or Anu or Anunnaki, then they were worth talking to because they had the skill to squirt their plasma through the heart of a star. And that's called growing up. We had that conversation before. So this was a little conversation about the background of why it is important to grow a coherent aura. We say that this is fundamentally the purpose of life. So, you know, we used to joke in the courses we did around the world that, you know, people say, well, I've been studying the purpose of life for, you know, 16 lifetimes, and here's my library, got 16,000 books, and I'm still studying the purpose of life. No, the purpose of life is quite simple. Get a big aura. It's real. And the cool thing is, it is not even selfish to want a large aura, because not only is it the only way to get an immune system and the only way to get immortal, to take memory through death, but also it's the only way to be a shareable wave. In other words, attracting charge in your aura, in a way, is the opposite of selfish. Do you know why? Let me put it this way. We always say if you're walking past a mountain and you see there's lots of chi in that mountain, lots of charge, lots of juju, lots of capacitance, lots of cold plasma, lots of spirit. We live on the sacred Cathar mountain, Canigoo near, sometimes, and between Australia and here. And when you're going by a mountain, the sword from the stone is whether the mountain is going to say, oh, I am going to give you my lightning, my capacitance, my charge. Now, what the Arthur and the land are one means, the arc on the Taurus means, the arc Ur, is that the sword will emerge from the stone under a very particular condition, which is a line of charge called energy will emerge from a circle of charge, which is called mass. So that sword from the stone, the S word from the S tone, as it were. That what allows the charge to emerge from the mass to go from the circle to the line, which is how you go from mass to energy, is the charge in that mountain is not stupid. This is a rotating ball of plasma that's been there for X number of million or however many years it's been there. And the charge in that mountain, like visualize dragons, is self-aware, phase conjugate, fractal, in the sense that the charge knows what structures will allow it to continue spinning and what structures will prevent spin. So if you're driving by a mountain and you're in an aluminum square box, you can be absolutely certain that that mountain is not going to give you its chi. No, because that mountain knows that as soon as it gives you its capacitance, it's dead. No. But if you're next to a mountain and you're in biological material and you have a shareable thoughts, then the capacitance in that mountain is aware that if it jumps into your body, it will gain more efficient charge distribution, more efficient spin density, more efficient embedding, literally a path to immortality. So all of the charge rotating around the universe, as the charge becomes more embeddable and more spinnable and more nested in more dimensions, which is more DNA, all of that charge gets to be self-aware in one specific sense, is it always wants to jump on board wherever the spin is going to last forever. This is why pure intention attracts capacitance to you and why your aura gets bigger if you actually become shareable as a wave. There's a very important scientific experiment you can do in this regard, which I think is very enlightening, is you take a carload of overactive children and you drive past a very alive river. Just at that moment, most of those children are going to want to pee. And you know why? What is the physics? Because remember, people were only invented by water because water wanted a way to move around. That's very important to know. And so when the water inside your body gets near water that's very fractal, very flowing, more embedded, more connected, more phase conjugate, more spin dense, the water in your body says, let me out of here. I want to join the water that has charge that's going to live forever. So if you're standing next to a really live river, you're going to need to pee because your water is saying, hey, join the flow to immortality. Another scientific example is why you do not want to sleep over underground water or a river. It's because your aura knows that in that water flow is a path to sustainability. And therefore, while you sleep, your aura says, bye-bye. So if you want to keep your aura with you when you sleep, do not sleep over underground water. Or actually, life in boats, not the best, etc. But this is a classic geobiological example. So this is the nature of the self-awareness of conjugate or embedded charge rotations called the Holy Spirit. And access to that living body electrically requires an understanding of the science. You know, all of these religious traditions were beautiful in their day, but they're obsolete once you understand the science, because at that point, it's all self-empowerment. No priest, no miracle worship, no personality worship required. It's simply a matter of understanding why that charge wave wants you, once you learn to distill from it pure principle and pure intention. Another example, when the famous Jasmine, she's teaching people, and we talked about this before too, but she's teaching people how to live without food. Very useful. You know, I think it's nice to eat some of your environment because that's embedding too, but very good skill to have, how to live without food. And of course, you learn to breathe, track chi, and you learn to be in charge sense environments, and you need to learn to be barefoot in nature, basically, grounding, earthing. The book is called Earthing. But the other cool thing is, Jasmine says, in addition to those things to learn to build your aura, because charge is the food, in addition to those things, you need to be living a certain number of hours in your day doing what you believe is your highest level of service. Why is that required in order for your aura to be growing, so you don't need food, or just your aura to be growing, period? Why? Because it's Eros Thanatos defined in the Jungian sense. Thanatos, urge to death, is triggered when your deep inner self does not believe you are any longer being of service. And I don't just mean, oh, you know, I'm serving the poor, I'm serving my neighbors. That's part of it. But the deeper part is true, deep, powerful service to the collective unconscious, the biologic well from which all pure principle derives. Service at a very, very deep level. And this is so that when you believe you are serving at that sense, then the telomeres of the DNA are informed, you don't need to die now. So the triggers for cancer and all these things relate at such a deep and profound subconscious level. The Hamer study on the psychokinetic, psychodrama origins of disease, that the urge to death is triggered fundamentally when you stop believing you are doing your highest level of service. And the opposite of that is when you do believe you are doing your highest level of service, there is a river of charge to the center and you do not age. Remember, we said the ancestors, they came here and they said they needed to build a Shem unto the Lord, which we now know is a phase conjugate implosive capacitance. They originally called the altar of the church. Sitchin called it the Highward Firestone. Shem, access to a black hole, literally an implosive bioactive field negentropic capacitor like Therify.net, which is time reversal, pure and simple physics. And why did they need to build time reversing? Why were they aging prematurely? The problem of time reverse negentropic, the problem of aging was the central problem of the origin of our whole race. This is what the Anunnaki were about. This is the Groundhog Day of the Draco. You know, we are the vaccine to their Orion Wars. It all started from understanding how you create the negentropic field. And this is time reversal. So if you look at the logo at Therify.net, those two things that we thought were pictures of light bulbs in ancient Egypt, they're in fact opposing plasma tubes at conjugate angles. And this was their age reversing physics. This is why 500,000 people now come to Sam Osmanagic's Bosnian pyramid a year. Specifically, he's documenting the rejuvenation effect there. And he's ordered a Therify because he understands it started with infrasound underground, increased negative ion. The infrasound is a phase conjugate pump wave, which is Schumann harmonic cascade. I've shown the equation is a negentropic implosion. And those harmonics are the harmonics that they then trigger in your brain waves, and you have the negative ion wind. And then you have the phase conjugate dielectric of the alternating layers of the clay, ancient geopolymer, and muscovite or shungite. So phase conjugate dielectric, phase conjugate pump wave, what is all this structure, the real physics of pyramid building? It's anti-aging. It is a rejuvenation field. We said that when the New England Antiquities Research Society, it's one of my favorite stories. I always tell my old stories. But when the New England Antiquities Research Society got together one day, and they said, now we have new proof that these stone circles were not used, or the stone quoits, the stone caverns, they were not used for food storage. Nope. They were not used for burial. Nope. They were not used to live in. Nope. So now they know exactly what they're not. They don't have a clue what they were. No, what they were time reversed bioactive field generators. Rejuvenation field. Bioactivefield.com. This is the science. Okay, I see. I'm typing over here. Bioactivefield.com. I see it is. It's 9 o'clock here. It's after 9, and we're more than halfway through. Have we gotten to the practical details yet? No. Let's get to the practical details. So, for some reason, I would like to talk about clothing. We're talking about, now remember, we're dividing the 4 aspects of the hygiene for bliss. The first was environment, which includes architecture and clothing. Second was the yoga, the movement, the kinesthetic. Third was the diet. And the fourth was the psychology, which we just talked about at some length. Why it is that if you're continuously thinking a shareable thought, you never die, and that in fact, quite literally, biology had to invent the concept of death. It's not a mistake that God made, and neither is pain, and neither is testosterone, by the way. I need to inform the women present. I'm joking. No, but that death was invented by biology to teach us to stop trying to store thoughts which were not shareable. It's fundamental. That if your mind is going in these little loops all the time about ideas and pictures and mentations which do not serve the all, ultimately you lose spin. It's fundamental. Whereas if you're the kind of scientist, which I try to be on my good days, is you're entirely always dwelling on pure principle. Even like when you're taking out the garbage and something strange happens. always you're thinking, what is the pure principle in that? What can I distill from that my ancestors a million years from now are going to need to know? My ancestors a million years from now will not need to know about tax laws. Maybe a little bit, but not very much. And my ancestors a million years from now are not going to need to know about football scores. Sorry, it just ain't going to happen. No, my ancestors a million years from now are going to need to understand the fractal nature of hydrogen, and they're going to need to know how to get their aura through death. That's real. So when you think about pure principle, you gain inertia in your aura, and that is immortality. That's charge, spin density, physics of Kundalini, and why I sometimes talk fast. So, nighttime lighting hygiene. Yes, you're right that synthetic lighting is very fatal to the aura, of course, even in daylight, but at night, the frequencies of the light that cause attention are well documented. Health and light, solar frequencies, sunlight replacing fluorescence in children's classes restores attention span. And the frequency signature, the sunlight, hydrogen, phase conjugate, fractal. So we know the frequencies of light that make attention and health possible. And you can look up the Bioactive Field Lighting Project at bioactivefield.com, and we have new business partners for that, and it is coming. We're taking the Moire glass, which we know increases life in seeds, and the frequency transmission spectrum we know is phase conjugate based on photosynthesis, and we know how to perfect that. So we are making bioactive lighting, and this will be the ultimate bioactive glass and bioactive lighting for greenhouses and incubation and attention span in classroom. Absolutely, we know what bioactive field lighting is. And that's the beautiful part, that when you understand these things, it's very appropriate to be commercial about it, because when you do something commercial, suddenly universities and governments take notice. Until then, they ignore you. And that's okay. It is the fun part. So I wanted to dwell on the clothing a little bit here. So I think maybe for this part of the conversation now, we've kind of talked for now enough about what is a shareable thought. Hopefully everybody here has a little bit of sense now of what it is to think a shareable thought, to distill pure principle out of any experience. One way to test, to find out if you've distilled the pure principle out of any experience, is the Gurdjieff before bed exercise, which was, you lie down, you're about to go to sleep, you close your eyes. Remember, at the moment of death, you need to see your whole life like it's a movie that went fast. The reason for that is the compression tests for sorting which waves were digested and became shareable, imploded, fractal, embedded. So, just before you go to sleep, you close your eyes and you play your day in front of you like it's a movie. Now, if you can turn on the movie of your day and just replay the movie, maybe even backwards, and you replay your whole day like a movie, and if you can do that without interrupting, that's the tricky part. Because every time you get to a part of your day which was stressful or is unprocessed or still contains anger, etc., you're going to interrupt that movie. And that means you have not digested your day, which means it's not ready for compression yet, which means it's not ready for death yet, which means it's not ready for charge distribution yet, means it's not ready for ancestors yet. You get the point? So it hasn't come to a point. And you have an appointment with that called death. And so what you do is you train yourself to be able to sort out every part of your day that still has charge on it, in the sense it still has anger or unprocessed pieces of your day. And as you learn to emotionally digest your day, then you totally relax, let it go. It's all done. It's all gone. The ancestors have it all. It's wonderful. And I'm at peace. Peacefulness is defined electrically as implosive fractal charge compression. That's what it is, because peacefulness has no other definition than negentropic implosion. That's what it is. And that's the essence of our universal curriculum for peacemaking. goldenmean.info/peace university. We have defined electrically peacemaking in brainwaves, in heart waves, in land waves, in geobiology, in the breath, in politics. Peacemaking is this ability to become centripetal and therefore negentropic. Only possible electrical engineer's definition of peacemaking, whether you're talking about brainwaves or breathing or land or politics. For example, when Callahan measured where war broke out, where the magnetic lines broke, Ireland, Yugoslavia, and Israel. And he showed you fix the magnetic line between village A and village B, and the war ends. It's literally failure to touch in the magnetism of the land. So you could predict by paramagnetic versus diamagnetic, where magnetism go through the land effectively, you do not have war. He found out because the tribes in South America, the ones that were headhunters, were always living on diamagnetic, which is to say magnetism does not pass through the soil. Whereas the friendly tribes were always living on magnetically conductive, permissive magnetic lines, and therefore village A and village B's emotion was communicating, and there was no war. During the war in Vukovar, Yugoslavia, the magnetic lines were broken and the underground water disappeared, and the women came back. They met the labyrinth and did the flowers and the feathers, and suddenly the underground water came back up to the surface. Vasodilation returns, and they made peace. Peace is when the magnetic field of the land became centripetal. It's very simple physics of peacemaking 101, which was embraced by the Norway group with the Oslo work with the Nobel group, and you had some recognition for that, and that curriculum is evolving. It's a beautiful thing. So, defining peacemaking based on fractal negentropy. So we were about to talk about more practically about clothing, architecture, and the environment. What I wanted to say about, so now we know what a shareable thought is, hopefully, right? We're closing that chapter of this conversation. I know what a pure intention is now, so I'm pure, hopefully. I hope you feel that way. So, clothing and architecture. You know how the people using Lakhovsky spark, square wave spark golden ratio implosive material, and now even more so with Therify.net, the plasma implosion, we're finding that in order to heal people, we want as little clothing as possible, and light and loose clothing, and natural materials only. Why do we say that? And what does this have to do with Sufi dancing and bliss? The Sufi master always said, you come to the Sufi dance as you would come to a lover. And this meant that you removed your metal, you removed your jewelry, you removed your tight-fitting clothing, you have loose clothing and natural fabrics and light clothing. This is so that your capacitance can breathe easily and efficiently. When Tesla was healing people with the high voltage sparks, when Guy Oblensky is using a more powerful version of the Lakhovsky in upstate New York with a little bit of the noble gases, which approaches what we're doing now more powerfully with Priori Therify.net. There they do it in the high voltage blue sparks play with manure. They do it naked. And naked is good. I mean, actually, this idea about guilt around clothing is so associated with guilt around women is a sad byproduct of the perverse ET origins of our religion, which we will be talking about 1 week from today. ET origins of DNA and culture. But suffice it to say that part of our guilt around clothing and sex had directly to do with access to your own creative juices. And well, that's next week's story. But the point for now is, I'm not saying people should do the Therify plasma thing naked. It's not necessary. But you should always wear as little clothing as possible to not be cold if you want to have charge, because your skin needs access to capacitance. When they were teaching children to see without their eyes, the Bronikov technique, if you covered the skin, the children could see without their eyes, no problem. But if you covered their skin, they could not see without their eyes. Or the children in Mexico so famously seeing colors with the tips of their fingers. The reason for this is the ability to implode capacitance through your skin is essential to building your aura, which is, and again, we recommend the book earthing.net about grounding. Specifically, if you're above the 3rd floor in any building, you're more likely to have health problems. This is documented but not often known because access to the Schumann harmonic cascade or grounding is central to getting a centripetal phase conjugate reference information ground for your aura. Basically, grounding for psychologists and electricians is access to fractality, which is to say perfected charge distribution. And that puts you in phase with and therefore embeddable. So second part of our clothing instruction, your shoes. I have here a leather sandal, and the bottom is very thin and hopefully made of a natural material or a natural rubber or perhaps leather. So you can get maximum capacitance through the earth possible. Walking around in thick-soled synthetic shoes is fatal to the aura. So you have these teenagers that have these thick rubber shoes, and they're only on sidewalks with metal steel bars in them all day, and over cement floors with steel in it all day. Of course, they do not have access to their intuition because they do not have access to ground. Again, the book, Earthing, it's a beautiful subject. So we have, the other story I wanted to tell about the natural fabrics was, and we've told this one story before also in this series, but our friend Joyce in Scotland was using a very powerful negative ion wind therapy, and she could eliminate all kinds of infections, very healing. She had a spinal meningitis infection, spine liquid, and she was able to boot that out of the body just with a super powerful negative ion wind therapy. Negative ions are proven to be essential for hospitals as well, documented in literature, and negative ion is a fragile little black hole. And the more negative ions you have, and you know what supports negative ions? Phase conjugate fractal implosion, verify that kind of thing. And negative ions are central to the measurements they made in the Bosnian pyramids, where they have the rejuvenation effect attended by 500,000 people a year. And what Joyce noted in her work was that in the therapy room, it was essential to have all natural material. If you had a lot of metal surfaces and electrosmog in the therapy room, the negative ion wind simply would not work. And by the way, in those cases, they actually grounded the body. Point being that clothing and architecture both have a similar requirement for Bliss hygiene. And that is under the title of organic materials, but organic materials, you can understand very practically why. Because every molecule that wants to join the very attractive club called life, very popular club, and any molecule that wants to join, in order to check in at the door, they have to get fractal or get dead, which is to say each molecule that joins the club of life rearranges its symmetry to be more phase conjugate or fractal. For example, clathrate water molecules are dodecahedral shaped, and clathrate water is some of the most bioactive and essential to electronic biology and cancer. The triplet state electron, Albert Szent-György's Nobel-winning book, Electronic Biology and Cancer. So all biologic materials have one thing in common, that the arrangement of the molecular array has gotten improved charge distribution efficiency, phase conjugate fractality. In other words, you know, hemp fibers and calcium, the calc in limestone, for example. Why is limestone so wonderful for building, and why is sandstone not nearly so wonderful? You know, limestone is a higher dielectric. It's a much better lens to breathe capacitive charge efficiency. So when we say get fractal or get dead to the molecules, what we're saying is rearrange your structure to breathe charge efficiently. Now, again, to review, generally that comes under the term of high dielectric constant. Choosing the material for the walls of your house or for your clothing. And high dielectric, again, to review the definition, if you have two metal conductive plates of a capacitor, the material between the plates of the capacitor, which is an insulator, determines the quality of the capacitor by its dielectric constant. And the dielectric constant simply means that it's the efficiency with which the capacitor rings like a bell, and it distributes charge through the matrix of the dielectric material, the insulator between the plates. The orgone being a very good example, conductor and organic material between the conductors. So orgone is an introduction to the better electrical engineering terminology of phase conjugate dielectrics. Phase conjugate being the charge lines converge like pine cones kissing noses. So if the dielectric constant of something like barium titanate or barium strontium titanate, which is the phase conjugate mirror defining phase conjugate optics, or Alice and barium titanate land the paper on phase conjugate dielectrics, if the capacitor has a dielectric which is high enough, that means when you hit the capacitor with a hammer called voltage, and it rings like a bell with more energy than the hammer you hit it with, that means your capacitor is a 0-point energy vacuum coherence, gets power from gravity device. It's a vacuum coherence device, implosive, just like most every pine cone, 2 to 14 millivolts end-to-end, or most chicken eggs when they're alive. So the ability to extract that voltage from gravity is related to high dielectric constant. Why does that matter to your body? For the same reason that a seed planted in a steel or aluminum growing pot is going to die, and for the same reason you and your children should not be in steel and aluminum buildings, because the capacitance of the steel and aluminum is opposite to fractal, opposite to conjugate, opposite to charge distribution. The capacitance is what's called harmonic exclusive, which means that the frequencies that will ring in there are only 1 or 2. That's exclusive harmonics, which is the opposite of life. We know that you can predict the survival of everything in the universe by measuring its harmonic inclusiveness. Started out with doctors realizing that's true of HRV, heart rate variability, but now we know you can predict the life duration of forests, atoms, babies, and galaxies the same way. How many harmonics are there? And harmonic inclusiveness, we know, is climaxed in phase conjugate fractality. The paper on that is from the heart rate variability literature is goldamine.info/holarchy. And the paper on it was called Bioacoustic Habitat Theory by Bernie Krause, goldamine.info/desertify, I believe is the, I get the spelling right. And so he proved, you could actually measure the forest harmonics, and, the forest has to, if one species of animal dies, the forest has to attract a species to replace that species of animal to make the sounds to fill that sonic spectral niche, or the forest starts getting sick. So the phase coherent fractal sonic membrane around the forest is its immune system, called bioacoustic habitat theory. The sound of a bulldozer alone is enough to start making a forest sick. And this becomes the physics of membrane theory in structural stability and morphogenesis, where the maximum foldedness on a surface defines the viability of a membrane. So harmonic inclusiveness predicts vitality. So Get Fractal or Get Dead has a very rigorous kind of mathematics biophysics there. So this was a background to why your aura so badly needs a biologic environment in order to unpack non-destructively. This means, in practical terms, probably it's going to be a little harder to lucid dream if your roof is made of metal. This means that you would work in your house to remove the steel and aluminum as much as possible and the electrosmog, and then you would get the steel and aluminum and electrosmog to one corner of the house as much as possible. That's what remains, and you live in the opposite corner, kind of thing. And which gradually allows your aura to breathe efficiently, which is to say implode, which is to say get fractal or get dead. So that I imagine when the young lady touched Jesus, and he didn't see, but he felt it, and she was healed at that moment. I'm imagining that his robe at that moment was probably made of hemp, actually, and probably an unbleached hemp. The hemp fibers are hemp fibers are some of the most vital DNA on the planet, and probably some of the most harmonic inclusiveness. So unbleached hemp fibers is how Phil Callahan made the probe used to measure life force in trees. Literally, hemp fibers dipped in sea salt or human sweat. I have some of that here now. Thank you very much. And then they would bake it in the sun. Profound biologic capacitor, high dielectric material. And then you'd connect that to the high impedance oscilloscope probe and dump into a preamplifier, like we used it to measure brainwaves. That was sensitive to about a microvolt. And that's how we measured goldenmean.info/trees, where we measured life force in trees with hemp fibers. And the measurements, that technology, we developed into a generalized technology for measuring life force in anything at goldenmean.info/biophoton. And so this ability to use proper dielectrics in clothing, we're developing at a project called Fractal Clothing. Fractal Clothing dot. No, it's fractalclothing.net. I'm sorry, fractalclothing.net. Yes, and basically, fractal clothing uses this principle that if you develop the right capacitance in the cloth, it becomes an amplifier for your aura. And there are many ways this is done. This is the Urim and Thummim are example. The breastplate was an example that the actual harmonic capacitance of your aura is tuned and amplified by the dielectric structures in the aura, and you can use as a lens for plasma projection. So fractal clothing introduces you to a lot of ancient sacred tradition, among them the breastplate. But for practical, simple terms, it's so essential that you choose natural fabrics and use living clothing. So let's see, we've talked a little bit about clothing, and we've talked a little bit about architecture. You know that in terms of the hygiene for Bliss, that the building is so essential to your aura's ability to inhabit the space, to implode and breathe charge. So we say in general, it's probably not a good idea to attempt Bliss process in a space that has too much metal or electrosmog or fundamentally bad air. And that is probably one of the most important lessons of our whole course on life force here, is the ability to choose fractal air. Remember where Korotkov is measuring life force in air by measuring charge distribution efficiency. He does it with a titanium probe and a Kirlian technique. I do it with a biophoton with my spectrum analysis of capacitance. It's the same thing. We agreed on it. We even exchanged transducers and swapped data, and we proved it with Korotkov. So, point being that dead air is going to kill you. It really will. That's why it is so hazardous to be indoors in dead air all winter. Truly a life-threatening situation. When you have to be in synthetic air, heated or cooled, there's some serious steps you need to take. First of all, adjust the humidity. I have the ultrasonic humidifier here. But more importantly is to understand what is fractionated air. You know, the leading architecture group of Dubai and I think it was Abu Dhabi was actually visited us, Professor, recently, asking for solutions to the fact that they recognize that air conditioning was killing them. They're quite aware that their aura is dying in air-conditioned air. What's the physics of that? Very important to understand the physics of that. And some of this curriculum is at goldenmean.info/architecture. But basically, here's how you know you're dying in air-conditioned air. You yawn a lot. Why are you yawning? Because you're not getting oxygen. That's what yawning means, is lack of oxygen in the brain. Why does air conditioning cause you to yawn? Why does air conditioning prevent oxygen from reaching your brain? Well, the metal fins in the air conditioning fan and the cooling material, where the air passes across metal, depletes the capacitance of the air, which is, say, literally shorts out the charge of the air molecules. So now, without the charge in the air molecules, the ability to support a negative ion, there's no place a negative ion is going to be killed quicker than in a metal air conditioning or heating unit. The negative ions do not have a prayer, and neither does your aura. And solubility of oxygen in your blood and brain requires charge density. So you go into a forest and the air is really charged, you breathe in, you get high oxygen solubility. You go in a room where air conditioning has been on for hours and you just pant and breathe, and you cannot get oxygen into your blood because there's no oxygen solubility. It's simple. So understanding what's depleting the air of charge is understanding what's depriving you not just of oxygen, but charge in your aura. That's why we need to develop a discipline to describe what forms of heating and cooling are fractionating versus fractal. Remember, in our architecture curriculum, we talked about fractal heating. The most fractal source of heat, solar heat, direct focused sunlight, very fractal, beautiful. Next fractal, maybe wood heat. Less fractal would be coal heat. Worse would be electric heat. And terrible would be microwave heat. So there's two aspects. The longer the wavelength of the heat, the healthier it is. That's why you feel great when the heat's coming through stone. But also, if the frequencies of the heat are more phase conjugate, that's enabling charge distribution. So you can actually measure and describe electrically what is fractionating heat with what is healthy heat. Practical example, this is our old joke. You always pay more. You're happy to pay more for the pizza that was cooked in wood rather than microwave. Why? Because the fractal source of heat is actually doing charge embedding, and the charge is the food. So you have fractal heat, and you have fractal cooling. So if the cooling goes through metal fins in a fan, any kind of fan is fatal to life force, because any kind of metal fan, if you have to have a fan, try to do it without metal, is fractionating. It's chopping up the capacitance of the air. So that's why a natural convection of heating or cooling, a natural convection of cooling through vaporized water, now you have fractal air conditioning. And the Arabs are beginning to recognize that it's life or death. So you can see where this conversation is leading. You can begin to understand building a fractal environment. We say, you make a magnetic map of your bed and your house and your garden and your village, and you start rearranging the magnetic lines to look more like a rose. Get fractal or get dead. And that's how you create sacred space. So in practical terms, means in your bedroom, you're going to check your mattress for metal springs, very fatal. Remove the metal from your bed, and then get all biologic materials there, and then get live air, and then remove the electrosmog and hopefully the Wi-Fi, and unplug the alarm clock and all those electrosmog generating devices. And then your aura has a chance at breathing. So then you move to your kitchen, et cetera, you get the flavor. So we're going to conclude now this section on architecture. So we've talked about the hygiene of thought for the hygiene for bliss. We've talked about environment, architecture, and clothing. And have we talked about the yoga? For the yoga, remember we said that the kinesthetic of movement, whether it's trance dance or yoga, it's actually the discipline of charge attraction. So every time the Tai Chi master is showing you the angle to move that curve at, such that you did that wave shape, so at the end of that motion you felt a tingle, and your Tai Chi master called that Chi, Orgone, Baraka, Shaktipat, and I call it living capacitance. The physics of the yoga is charge acquisition, charge implosion. So basically, to be a graceful person, where the quality of grace is the physics of implosive living charge, that the ability to not be a jerk, hint, Donald Trump. No, we're not supposed to make jokes like that. No, but the ability to not be a jerk is the ability to move with motions that attract capacitive charge. And this gracefulness is very sexy, of course, but it's also how your aura can be fed. So this is introduction to the Yoga 101. The other aspect of yoga is just that the muscle structure and geometry of your body, that every time you can add willfulness to a muscle structure, it becomes more phase embedded, the relationship between your intent, your will, and your soul, and that muscle. Whereas the more time you spend totally, relaxed, your muscles are localizing their charge. Whereas when your muscles are totally focused, and the thing is, then eventually, if you can get into a posture where you're totally focused and still relaxed, that's introduction to Kundalini. So a couple basics here is that relaxation equals conductivity, and the breath geometry equals the heart rate variability equals the spine liquid pump is the Kundalini mechanism, and that's what triggers the ventricles of the high brain. So you have the breath hygiene and the yoga of breath, which are our new application for sacrocranial work in iThrive.com, will provide some beautiful feedback cues for breathing in a caduceus and building that implosive wave up the spine liquid pump. So in general, the ability to do the yoga will determine how much lightning bolt you can survive inside of without losing discipline. So the more you get closer to intense bliss process, the more you require the yoga, because otherwise all of the weaknesses of the personality emerge. Sexual perversion, any weakness you have is going to be more pronounced as you get closer to Kundalini and deep bliss process. That's why the old saying, when they were teaching Zazen yoga, and they had to sit and meditate for days at a time, they said some of the most likely to succeed and not go insane trying to do deep Zen yoga were women who had succeeded with childbirth and had been through pain. They were much likely to remain sane through deep yoga training and deep Zen training, because you have that inner discipline to actually support intense charge. Because intense pain actually can be translated as intense feeling. So at first, Kundalini feels like a red hot poker that shoots up through your tailbone, and the top of your head feels like a red hot coal that you can't eject. And Gopi Krishna and Krishnamurti complained endlessly about their Kundalini like crybabies, instead of understanding the physics, which is that basically you need to learn to turn all of that charge density into a central lightning bolt that comes to a point, and stay with that point and reinterpret the pain as actually simply charge density. Well, so the wave mechanics of Kundalini require the ability to inhabit a lightning bolt, quite literally in the sense of Daniel Brinkley's near-death experience, and in the sense of the movie Powder. Eden was talking about having plants around to improve air and energy quality. Yes, Eden, thank you. And plants help support the negative ions, and plants help support the capacitance, in the sense of Baxter and Vogel, whom I worked with, both of them. Secret Life of Plants. So it's all very beautiful. Yes, yes. So my partner Valerie was supposed to be here tonight to talk a little bit about her work with Kundalini Yoga, but she has gone off to her choir practice. But suffice it to say that some form of disciplined kinesthetic is considered essential to survive bliss process. And whether it's Sufi dance or yoga or Tai Chi or tensegrity, castaneda, or the Gurdjieff gymnastics, whatever it is, we always say that if you see fire in the eye of the teacher, that's a good sign. But remember, in the in the movie Meetings with Remarkable Men and Gurdjieff's adventures, and it's close to my heart because I was trained at the Gurdjieff School, claymont.org. Here's where I received my Gurdjieff sacred gymnastic training at George Washington's nephew's pig farm in West Virginia, Charlestown. And in the Gurdjieff film, at the end, when they do the sacred gymnastic, you can actually see the cloud of charge build up where they're, you're doing that motion, forming twos, where one hand is moving at frequency X and the other hand is moving at frequency Y, and then your head is moving at frequency X over 2, X over 4, X over 8, and ultimately you have 4 to 8 octave harmonics in your body movement, and you're containing all those frequencies in your kinesthetic focused awareness at once, doing the embedding, and your aura grows. But in the Gurdjieff movie, The Meetings with Remarkable Men, at the end, the cloud of charge that builds around the Gurdjieff gymnastic is palpable. They say it actually burned its way into the celluloid of the film. That was the story that was told. But you get the sense of doing this powerful sacred movement together, and you have insight into the physics of ritual, which is, to study the physics of ritual, watch meiosis and mitosis. The molecules are doing the dance to embed their short waves into a longer wave, and thus phase lock with the life force of a larger intent, a larger field, a larger being, which is to say the next cell division of that cell. So embedding in the longer wave, negatropic structure, is introduction to the physics of ritual. Hence sacred dance, Sufi dance, and even tensegrity. So the need for yoga is clear if you want to be on the path of bliss or ananda. So now we've talked about yoga, environment dance. We haven't talked about diet. Yes. Remember when we said you're choosing your food in the grocery store based upon whether it will feed your aura. So basically you're seeking charge. And this is a fundamental instruction in avoiding processed food, because almost all processed food has had its charge depleted. So anytime you can start with a whole anything instead of starting with a chopped up anything is good. Like, it's basic. If you bite into a whole apple, you feel a tingle in your cheek. It actually goes, you feel a tingle. Or if you bite into applesauce, you do not feel that tingle. The new information here is that tingle is the food. The charge is the food. So that's why, I was cooking my millet, undercooking my millet in coconut oil and coconut milk every day for breakfast. It's a millet alkalizes, and that's wonderful for blood. And then I put some fresh nuts and goji berries and hemp hearts in after cooking the millet. Well, one day I decided I had some ground millet. And I did that. And I noticed that instead of my breakfast lasting me for 3 or 4, whatever, hours, that breakfast burned out a lot quicker. So if I started with ground up millet in my porridge, instead of whole millet in my porridge, my breakfast burnt more quickly, and it didn't last me till lunchtime. So what was the difference, ground millet versus whole millet? It was a simple thing, but it's a very important lesson here, that the longer the wave, the more embedded spin density, and therefore the more charge. So this is called Whole Foods 101, but it's the physics of fractionation versus fractality. Other things about diet is, they say when you select your food, great classes on food at Learn It Live. Thank you. Good idea. And everybody has their thoughts about diet, and I think many of these people are doing wonderful work. I'm just suggesting new ways into understanding electrical engineering of diet for chi and charge and life force. The other thing that I'm suggesting is that as you select your choices in the grocery store, you have an interview with each piece of food, and you say, when was the last time you experienced genetic diversity? Which gives me excuse to tell another one of my favorite stories, is that we had this labyrinth and heirloom seeds garden at Crystal Hill Farm in Eden in western New York. And Twyla Nietzsche and the Seneca Indians helped me plant this heirloom seeds garden. And so we had 7 different colors of indigenous tomatoes and potatoes and beans. They were like multicolored everything, extreme open-pollinated heirloom seed genetic diversity in this garden. It was like a riot for the elementals. And we had the pine trees. It was really cool. Labyrinth. And but one thing I'd like to tell you about our heirloom seeds garden is that actually it was my friends Darlene and Vincent were visiting us there one day in western New York overlooking Lake Erie. And somehow somebody commented, "Oh, eating these vegetables is better than LSD." What they meant was you ate these vegetables of extreme genetic diversity. It's kind of like Jack and the Beanstalk. And you close your eyes and you'd see colors and lights. This was extremely happy DNA. The opposite of that is, of course, today's monocultured corn or monocultured wheat, which has been monocultured for maybe hundreds of generations or at least dozens of generations. And this is called angry DNA because monoculture makes DNA angry in the same way that if someone's father and son for a dozen generations had been in a jail, well, that child is going to be an angry child. Why? Because it did not have access to genetic diversity. And so access to genetic diversity is functionally equivalent to happy DNA versus angry DNA. And the fundamental criteria here is do not eat angry DNA. Whereas in ancient times, when the Hopi planted that blue corn had been genetically diverse and in the family for 100 generations or so, and that DNA would only germinate when it heard the right song. And that DNA was like the family pet. This was intelligent DNA. And I want to say, as I've said before, that I was physically present when the cornmeal from Grandfather Dan of the Hopi, and I want to thank Susan Ambrose, who was a shaman who worked with the Hopi, she used that cornmeal, and I physically, on many occasions, I saw that cornmeal call the wind. Now, why was that able to call the wind? You could whisper that, and you use that cornmeal, and you get a gust, just like that, just a total system, big gust of wind. You could call the wind with that cornmeal. That was happy DNA, extreme genetic diversity, and very implosive and very embeddable in a long wave. It's like picking up a pine cone in a forest. If you set your intent, you can call the rain because you can implode the capacitance. Wayne says the best meal of my life was with the Hopi. Exactly. And this is the whole Jack and the Beanstalk story. Jack and the Beanstalk story also. So, in terms of diet, you're really seeking genetic diverse happy DNA and plant and foods that have not been mass produced or mass processed. Also foodstuffs that have been stored in material that can hold capacitance. So avoid contact with metal and that sort of thing. And then there's the aspect of the oils. First of all, we did have a chart of grains that, in general, in the West, the grains that still had the max chi and life force genetic diversity, quinoa, millet, amaranth. These are some of the better ones. And rice was somewhere in the middle. And most of the wheat and corn and a lot of the white rice DNA now, unfortunately, is so monoculture that it's actually makes mucus. And white bread, in my view, white flour and white bread is literally a poison. It makes mucus possible. Everybody here knows that. That's old news. But you see this science behind that. And then in terms of the oil, from the film Lorenzo's Oil, we know that the myelin sheath, the insulator in your nervous system, is oil. And so if the oil is not correct, your nervous wiring does not have an insulator, and that means you can't do high voltage, namely Bliss. So it's critical to get the right oils in there. And of course, the hemp oil, the raw olive oils. An extreme danger of eating heated oils. There's a few oils that can do heat, like sesame, but most oils are really damaged by heat. And the best oils need refrigeration. And this is, again, old news for most people here. And in terms of eating meat, it is my view that the vegetarian diet is useful for most people because people have had too much meat and they need to sort of cleanse also excess protein. But on the other hand, during intense bliss structure, and bliss experience, we even found this with the Buddhist teachers, that intense bliss experience, it's very critical to have high quality protein. So conversely here, we were joking when I was lecturing in London at the Macrobiotics conference, was that if you wanted to write a textbook on protein starvation, all you need to do is take pictures at the Macrobiotics conference, because the sunken cheeks. Are essential oils electrically beneficial in some way? Yes. Well, essential oils, have the capacitance of the plant structure. We did a frequency signature of the essential oil of rose, for example, and showed how it completely differed from synthetic rose oil. And that's at goldenmean.info/biophoton. So essentially, essential oils are a way of concentrating the capacitance of the natural structure in a highly dense fluid natural oil medium. And that became our AIDS solution, which we did with Christian, and that's another story. But essential oils are wonderful in that regard, yes. But so we were talking about the meat, just that you do need high quality protein, but it's very tricky to get high quality protein without getting karma. I mean, bad karma. And this relates to the Aboriginal. I did know that my friend Aboriginal shaman, wonderful Steve Tribeck, and want to thank him here, who helped produce the Whale Dreamers film. He used to, have a lucid dream the night before and meet the fish. He would then go spearfishing the next morning, and the fish that chose to become part of the family's memory would approach, and he would remember from the dream, and there was an agreement, and that fish would be. It was amazing, and actually, it's a real story. That then you can honor the memory in that flesh with such nobility that the animals is the spirit lineage of that animal tribe is grateful for you for eating that meat. But that's an extreme, and that's very difficult to accomplish. So in general, you can plan on having to process the pain of the animal you ate, and having the mucus that forms and the dream that forms be the pain of the moment that animal died. Now, I sometimes still do eat fish here, but even then, Valerie's after me. But, with Enki as an ancestor, he was a dolphin, so. Still, recognize that you expect to deal with the pain of the death, the moment of death of whatever you're eating. It's very appropriate. And to deal with that in a lucid dreaming fashion, in a proper shamanic way. So sources of high quality protein, of course, properly prepared chi-chi or mung beans are very wonderful, and lentils are wonderful, et cetera, et cetera. And in general, probably we're saying more than half your diet should be live food or raw food. We talk many times about what makes enzymes alive, or fractal, which is to say, why an enzyme dies at such a critical temperature. An enzyme is basically implosive and fractal, and therefore participates, embeds in self-awareness. So when you kill all the enzymes in your food, you can expect to die quickly. And enzymes are fragile. So, for example, in my breakfast recipe, going back to that, so the only thing you cook is what must be cooked. And everything that must be cooked, you cook it as little as possible just to make it edible, and then that's it. And everything that doesn't have to be cooked goes in after cooking. So, for example, again, my breakfast recipe, coconut, it's coconut milk with the rice milk, and then I'm cooking this whole millet. And when the millet is soft enough, then to turn down the heat, then I add raw coconut oil and coconut cream and raw cashew butter and goji berries, hemp hearts, possibly a bit of honey, some days not, and then 3 or 4 kinds of raw nuts. And this is all stirred in and creamy, but after cooking. And it's the same way in your stir fry. In the stir fry, you're putting in everything that must be cooked and cooking it just enough so that it's just barely cooked. And then everything that doesn't require cooking, you put in after cooking. This is true of your soups, for example. So all of the fragile things in the soup, like the vinegar and the lemon and the seaweed, and almost everything that doesn't have to be cooked goes in after cooking, especially the miso, for example. So again, all these are techniques for getting the live enzymes into your diet. So, so that was an example of a breakfast. And now, example of lunch, of course, is a wonderful salad, all this raw food, and maybe your wheat germ and your nutritional yeast and your sunflower seeds and your raw oil. So you have a huge, gorgeous, beautiful salad, and then maybe your lentil soup, etc., or your mung bean soup when you need cooked food. In cold weather, you need a little more cooked food, of course. And then occasionally, depending, I do some seafood sometimes, and even that's very tricky. Where do you find a happy organic salmon, for example? And my partner does not do seafood, and you can see why. But the point being that other diets, if you're doing a lot of dairy or breads or carbohydrates, you're going to get a lot of mucus. And in terms of the breads, that goes back to our hierarchy of grains here. That actually the grain that still has the most genetic diversity here in France is called petit épeautre, which is little spelt. So the spelt is still, and there's some rye here that's still good, but most of the wheat and other grains here in France has lost genetic diversity and seriously causes mucus, in my humble opinion. Now, when I was in Germany more, we find that more of the wheats had some genetic diversity in Germany. Some of the dark wheat was still quite wonderful, but I would stick with the rye and the quinoa and the spelt. So I see it is after 10. Oh yes, what about soaking? Thank you, Eden. Good point. So the best way to eat any of this stuff is, of course, sprouted. Wonderful thought. So if you can sprout it and have live sprouted bread, etc., etc. Yes, sprouting is wonderful. And sprouting is such a beautiful way. And if we were doing this route, we would eat seed cheeses made of sprouted seeds. This is a wonderful way to go on a raw food diet. Yes. And a raw food diet clearly is a way. It's just that if you're going to go on a raw food diet or a strict vegetarian diet, really look at some of the nutritional aspects. I take quite a few supplements. I take all these. I have the bottles right here. I take mineral supplements and vitamin supplements and vitamin E and flax oil and vitamin C. I do use some supplements, and I use a series of Chinese herbs. I'm using the dragon herbs from Ron Teagarden, dragonherbs.com, I believe. There's a wonderful, Roger teaches about that stuff. There's some amazing dragon herbs that are just wonderful. And one of them is cordyceps, which, is the mushroom, which is very, very vitalizing. Also, I'm using something like the microhydrin we talked about last year, Primo H2, which is a free radical scavenger. I think it's even more powerful than microhydrin, perhaps. It's from, it's called Primo H2, and it's from primonutra.com, implosive hydrogen, and what else? Well, the usual, but it's important if you're on a raw food or strict vegetarian diet to really look at critical nutrients. For example, B12 and the B vitamins are so essential and so hard to get and so missing from today's food chain. Okay, what about soaking healing? Yes, raw cannabis female bud juice is a great healer, not to be smoked. Powerful. Yes, raw cannabis. Actually, again, cannabis hemp being some of the most vital DNA on the planet, and we're using hemp hearts here, and hemp oils are so famous for cancer work now, very useful, and so yes, very relevant here. So what have we missed in the Bliss hygiene conversation? We've talked about the mental discipline of thinking shareable thoughts. We've talked about environment, the clothing, and the architecture. We've talked about the yoga, the discipline of movement. We've talked about the diet. What about things like soul group and lucid dreaming? What we're saying in some of the earlier courses in terms of temple architecture was that we tend to reincarnate in soul groups, and we do that because there's a kind of pod or charge envelope possible in that way, like the soul group around Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, for example, which then became the Essenes. Now, what you want to do is find a group that you can do bliss process and lucid dreaming together. That's the goal. It probably starts with doing a bit of yoga together and maybe having, dinners together and then crying. They say that you cry for each other's pain, and as soon as everyone present has cried for someone else's present pain, eventually you fuse and you bond, and you'll be able to feel each other's pain more intimately. And eventually this translates into a practice after you're doing your yoga and your sacred gymnastic and bliss process together, sort of a collective tantra, that eventually you begin to be able to practice lucid dreaming together. Remember, we said that the ability to lucid dream is powerfully indicative of ability to take memory through death, because it is the phase coherence of your aura that allows you to take your perception with you in the dream and in the death. Remember in the book, the famous book, 9 Faces of Christ, where he's trying to rejoin the body of his lover when he's in an isolated. So the first time he lucid dreams to his lover, he takes his sense of sight, but he cannot smell her or taste her. The next time, so each next time he lucid dreams, he's able to take another organ of perception with him. Do you dream in color? Question mark. So the idea is that as your aura gains electrical coherence, you take more organs of perception with you when you lucid dream or die. Visualize a more coherent, more harmonic, inclusive plasma domain bubble, ghost, aura, ka, body. Your ka is your boat into your underworld. The coherence of your aura determines if you have a ka. Hence, electrically, we recommend measuring the aura coherence to find out if the Pope is a Catholic. It'd be a very good exercise, I think. So, the ability to take this ka with you evolves, and you do this as a group. And then we believe that Akhenaten's assignment to build Amenti Amarna as a solar temple was effectively that the Syrians, in this case, the bloodline behind the Akhenaten impulse, we think in the sense of God King Akhenaten by Daniel Stewart, the book, that they knew that as a gene pool, we would be stuck in kindergarten unless we could collectively project our aura back through our sun, our star, the heart of which, seen clairvoyantly, is an Anu, a slip knot, the same as the heart of hydrogen. So basically, the only way as a plasma body for the inertial escape velocity in and out of the solar system is through the heart of the sun. It's fundamental Atun physics. So you're stuck unless you can get through the Stargate. They called it Dharana. An example of a Stargate would be the plasma tubes of Theraphi. And the wars were over a Stargate because unconsciously you knew you were stuck in a kindergarten a long way from downtown unless you could get your plasma body back through your star. One of those places, Dharana Stargate, was named Uru Asa LM, Uru of the ancient dragon blood, Asa, queen of, or the royal, meaning shift, El, the place of the phase shift, Jerusalem. But the war over Jerusalem, Dharana the Stargate, could probably now be canceled because that Stargate is broken. Misaligned. Sorry, it don't work anymore. Yeah, forget the war. No, the issue is to do the process necessary to take the plasma of your soul group out through the heart of the star. And that is what Akhenaten's homework assignment, and we're going to talk about this at length 1 week from today in the ET Origins conversation. But basically, Amenti Amarna project, his star accelerator, solar complex Bliss theater, where a soul group could then come together at the right time and space in the Bliss plasma projector called Dharana, Uru Asa LM, or Elim's port in Pennsylvania is another example, the place where the L's were ported. It was in the Eagle, near the Eagle map in Pennsylvania, near this eye of the Eagle. They have a website about that. GoldenMean.info/ Eaglemorph, I think it is. So the place of phase shift or plasma transition, translation of vorticity, or L as in Elohim, simply meaning translate the inertia from the transverse to the longitudinal up the phase angle of the golden spiral on the conic spiral, how transverse becomes longitudinal, to become one of the L's. Remember, L is the geometry of the pattern of the ancient star Alpha Draconis, and hence the symbol for L in Arabic means Draco. And they were the source of those who could implode and phase trans, which is to say, make longitudinal plasma components from their blood and project their plasma into longitudinal waves and thus make it through the star. So, how do the 101 beginning of that is you begin to work with your soul group to have bliss process together, eventually to have access to these plasma projection sites, the temples, which are properly charged aligned, like the tube out the pyramid that points to Sirius and Orion at the right time of year, or the star map of Orion on Giza, or the star map of Alpha Draco on Angkor Wat, or the Hopi had star maps of Orion. So this was a plasma projective device to re-embed your group's plasma back through into the stars. And this is advanced geobiology. This is advanced bliss science. But the point is that you're preparing your, Mother Nature's silver seed for a new home in the sun, in the sense that if you start to recognize members of your soul group and begin to do the discipline of your collective bliss practice and yoga together and begin to form a bond such that then your group gains the collective inertia, that then you can eventually use that in sort of the Stargate physics. And remember, the alphabet used to make the movie Stargate, Ophana Enochian, the hypercube. Implosion sequencing of plasma domains. And this is introduction to how you get a gene pool to graduate. And basically, it isn't escapist to want to go through the heart of the sun. It's the only way to graduate from kindergarten. And the problem is the kindergarten is about to break because the local logistics holding the kindergarten is getting worn out. The sun went to a lot of work to breed a gene pool because we could make a centripetal force our star needs, just like the environment needed the centripetal force of the Tibetan that died. However, the real estate in this solar system is known to be of relatively low value for long-term occupation because our sun tends to burp quite often, and therefore it isn't considered stable here. Like, you don't want to hang out here for long term. One example, when Maurice Cotterell was writing Tutankhamun prophecies, proving that the Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerica was literally the same intelligence of Viracocha that was the Tutankhamun. So the solar physics of the Egyptian Tutankhamun was the solar physics of Quetzalcoatl. It tells you something. And so here's Quetzalcoatl writing on the lid of Palenque, which is a 3D computer animation. It's lovely from Maurice Cotterell. And what was his message? His message was, well, the geometry of the solar flares right now is preventing female ovulation. Therefore, we're out of here. So Viracocha and his family skip town. They're out of here because the sun flare pattern geometry is preventing women from ovulating. And Maurice Cotterell did some really good homework in that regard, I think. But here's an example. So the solar neighborhood is a fun place to grow up DNA, only in limited periods. And then the DNA needs to graduate, or the sun has to clean out the kindergarten. And that's sort of what's about to happen. So the solar bliss, the human bliss activities need to learn to grow up and inhabit their star, which is the centripetal force, which we enable sustainable star birth with. Remember, when 11 different times it was measured, the solar flares changed dramatically when more than 1 million children sang the same song. That tells you some physics. It says we make something centripetal that our star needs. Hence, Kurt Vonnegut's question has finally been answered when he was having the breakfast of champions whiskey at the bar. His question was, what are people for? Okay, let's do questions. Speaking of questions. Yes, in Spain, this is practiced live. So let's do this. And the force field is so powerful, we lost the movement lower by 4 hours. Dan. Oh, he lost movement in the lower body. What did you do that lost movement, Kevin? collective bliss process. That's what this is about, which is to say that soul groups need to form and fuse and learn collective aura coherence, collective aura hygiene. This is what is meant when the Tibetans say, come into the fold with this particular saint. They call that taking refuge. What that means is once you embed yourself into this aura of your saint or advanced shaman or guru, you're taking refuge in the sense that then the plasma, the aura field, collective plasma field of that lineage of saints is going to protect you in a way from astral parasites and help guide you. That can be a good thing if you chose that lineage of spiritual masters well. However, there is another side to that, which is to say, if you then embed yourself in the lineage of one particular saint, for example, and this is not miracle worship, this is like literally using the aura intelligently. And like the Tibetans would encase with gold that certain saint, because there would be a touch place for that aura of that saint. But the converse side of that is then once you do that, you're not allowed to have strong negative emotions because the whole soul group will feel it if you go into negativity. So this is how the spiritual family works, is that everybody has to prop each other up. And if any one member really loses it, the whole family is really somewhat traumatized. So you're sort of taking responsibility for a collective body in a plasma kind of way when you choose a spiritual family to embed in. So this involves a whole discipline. This is how the Ananda Marga tradition works, how the Tibetan tradition worked, etc., etc. So important to form nuclear families, spiritual families. And this is so challenging in today's world because the laws of almost every culture on the planet right now prevent spiritual communities intentionally. I mean, the U.S. government destroyed family farms in general by deciding to pass laws for decades to prevent the existence of family farms, which is to say spiritual communities. Why? Because they wanted agribusiness. They're beginning to reverse that now, but for decades the laws were all the laws were designed to prevent the survival of family farms. Well, what happens in cultures like this? So we have to recognize that groups that have access to bliss together are a huge threat to any government on the planet. Why? Because a collective bliss group is a government. That's why there are religion wars, because once you have a collective bliss group, that is the definition of body polis, which is the origin of the word politic. Ha! So if there's no bliss access, there is no collective plasma. The definition of body polis, the origin of the word politics. So functionally, if access to bliss does not define government, then politics is going to cause war because there is a misunderstanding of the purpose of having a government. Because look, if the only way to get immortal and have an immune system and get sustainable and do all the things that really define life is to get a big aura to actually have access to Ananda or bliss, therefore, from a biophysics perspective, there can be no other definition of the function of having a government. So am I suggesting a revolution? No. But am I suggesting that governments need to understand that they need to pass laws based on feeding people's aura, access to bliss, because that's the only way to get sustainable for people or governments. Plus, a group of people that has a regular access to bliss have the climax form of decision-making collective ability. It's like this. Supposing, now people vote on a senator and then they vote on a president, and 4 years later and 8 years later a decision gets made, and so decision-making process takes years and years and years to get from one person's decision to a national decision. Now just supposing that about every 10 minutes to 2 hours, there was a national vote on everything. We could do that now with the internet. It'd be so easy. We could collect 400 million votes in a matter of hours and everything. So first would be a vote, every week, and then every day, and then every hour. And all the major decisions of that country were made totally democracy, absolute grassroots democracy. And the rate of feedback defines the rate of increase in self-awareness. That means that as you shorten the feedback loop between when you made the decision and when you feel the pain, responsibility, as that loop shortens, I voted there, and now I voted here, now I voted there. Now I'm voting every 30 minutes on each decision. Every 4 to 8 hours, I make a decision, I get on, click, 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 click. And suddenly, collective decision making becomes instant biofeedback. Instant biofeedback means, no, you really don't. You don't even need a president. All you need is a decision-making apparatus, which is instant collective biofeedback. And that's essentially what the collective plasma body is doing when the tornado, which is your collective aura, is going back through the sun, getting the decision-making feedback loop down to infinite recursion. So all I'm saying is, if you want spiritual democracy, it would be a faster voting mechanism. Okay. And this becomes Fractal Economics.net, which is our project on fractal economics, which is basically the rate at which distribution is served. Money is just a media for describing the distribution of human energy. That's the definition of money. It's a symbol for human energy in distribution. So what we know from the electrical nature of health versus cancer is that the more there is distribution and the less there is storage, the more you have fractality and the more you have life. So perfected distribution equals the elimination of storage equals fractal economics equals perfect money, which is to say, it's like just in time except taken to its logical limit. So fractal economics is a way of studying perfected distribution of energy and money, and then you begin to pass tax laws, for example, which actively make it expensive to store and less expensive to distribute, and it's related to the Prout system of an on the market. Robert says, Dan, in relating to fractal economy, does multi-level marketing model business being distributed energy? Is that some of the fractal economy? Well, multi-level marketing can, I suppose. The idea is that the actual business hierarchy, instead of being hierarchical, will be branched in a perfect tree structure or fractal. So, multi-level marketing has that tree structure potential, but there's also all kinds of issues with multi-level marketing, which can get inefficient, even fee structures, etc. And in their worst case, they become a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme is an example of multi-level marketing gone bad. So perfecting distribution, I'm not saying we have all the answers to economic theory. Economic theory is a profound and wonderful subject. But at its core, we do need to know exactly what money is, only a symbol for human energy in distribution. That's all it can be. And perfected energy distribution is well defined. It's called fractal, which is to say perfected distribution is perfected compression, is therefore the elimination of storage. In a perfect fractal distribution tree, there's almost no storage required. And if there were no storage required, if distribution was perfect, that defines abundance. There's plenty of food on the planet. There's plenty of money on the planet. It's just not distributed right. Well, what's the definition of perfect charge distribution? Fractality. What is the definition then of perfect money and food distribution? Fractality. So it's obvious that fractal economics is the solution, but implementing it would require some study, but it's clear that fractality has a lot to say to the understanding of economics and therefore human bliss, which is also charge distribution perfected. Spiral lit or spirit is a name for distribution. So long as we are fractal first and empathic, give to get. Yes, it's really true that the thing about giving in order to receive is to give to the highest level of service. So it's always like, well, it is not selfish to take care of you best if you know deep inside that you're doing a very high level of service, a very high level of giving. Then your body is absolutely confident that I'm worth it. I'm worth taking very good care of because I am giving at a very high level. And when you feel that deep in your soul, that is the opposite of Thanatos. That is Eros defined. After I built a massive spiral of paramagnetic stones using external waves set off, creating massive torus field. Oh, yes. Yes, massive seed generation over a wide area. Oh, that's a nice story. Yes, exactly. That's what we have in mind here. Robert. Yes. So the use of paramagnetic stone geometry to create these fields is a deep and powerful study, and you can create fertility with that. In fact, we believe that Therify.net will be the ultimate seed germination electric treatment. We know that, as we said, that Burke and Levengood got 30 to 50% seed growth improvement in seeds from their high voltage seed treatment. We think Therify will be the best. So the use of these geobiologic structures to create fertility was how civilization was saved in a time of starvation. We think this is what the Virocana effect was. We discussed this Virocana effect in the article goldenmean.info/Malta with Vincent Bridges Malta. That basically that the survival of civilization was determined by the ability to use dolmen to create wormholes through death for shaman, which is access to ancestor memory, and the hermetic use of hypogeum kinds of structures to create seed germination to save agriculture. So that without understanding this hermetic concept of what is a bioactive field, gene pools are at risk, truly. And so we dedicate this evening's conversation to Hermes, whose symbol, the caduceus, is phase conjugation. Okay, any last questions? Thank you, Lisa. Enjoyed very much. I got Fractal bumper sticker in the mail. Yes, blissful New Year to you too, also, Lisa. Thank you very much. And thank you, Robert. Blessings to everybody. So I hope we got a good outline of the science of bliss here, and let's put it into practice. That's our homework. Bye, Wayne. Bye, everybody. We had some fun. Stay in touch. Next week is the ET origins. Good night now. Take care. Bye-bye.